We need to get him to surgery immediately. Doctor, you're with me.
Important to remember all the good times we shared.
I know, and I cherish every single one of them, my dear.
So as you can see from these charts, the patient's vitals have stabilized. We'll continue monitoring.
We need to monitor his vitals closely.
In the gleaming corridors of Princeton Medical Center, Miguel moves quietly through the early morning shift, his footsteps barely audible against the polished floors. The scent of disinfectant mingles with fresh coffee from the nurse's station, and the soft beeping of monitors creates a rhythmic symphony of healing. He pushes his cart methodically from room to room, emptying trash bins, mopping floors, restocking supplies like clockwork every single day. No one knows that just 5 years ago, he was saving lives in emergency rooms across Mexico City. No one even notices when he pauses outside patient rooms, his trained ear catching the subtle changes in heart monitor rhythms that others miss. But when the attending physicians struggle with a complex diagnosis, he observes from the shadows, his weathered hands gripping his mop handle as medical terminology flows naturally through his thoughts. Dr. Patterson storms past him again, barely acknowledging his presence. "We're losing him," she mutters to Dr. Williams, their voices tight with frustration. The patient's presenting with chest pain, elevated troponin levels, but his EKG is showing something unusual. We've run every test twice. Miguel freezes mid-motion, his cleaning supplies forgotten. Those symptoms, that combination, he's seen it before. His pulse quickens as he recognizes the pattern that seems to be eluding the medical team. "Doctor," Miguel says softly, his accent thick but his voice steady. "Perhaps you consider Brugada syndrome? The EKG pattern, it can be very subtle, especially in young males." Dr. Patterson whips around, her eyebrows raised in surprise, and something, "That looks like irritation." "Excuse me?" Her voice carries that familiar tone, the one that suggests he's overstepped some invisible boundary. Dr. Williams chuckles condescendingly. "I think you should stick to what you know best," he says, gesturing toward the cleaning cart. "Leave the medical diagnostics to those of us who actually went to medical school." But Miguel doesn't flinch. Instead, he maintains eye contact, his dignity intact despite the dismissive treatment. "The sodium channel mutations," he continues. "Calmly, they cause the characteristic pattern in leads V1 to V3. In Mexico, we see this condition more frequently in certain genetic populations." The silence that follows is deafening. Several nurses stop their conversations, sensing the tension in the air. Dr. Patterson's expression shifts from irritation to something approaching curiosity, though she quickly masks it. "That's actually not impossible," she admits reluctantly, then catches herself. "But I think we'll handle this from here." Miguel nods respectfully and returns to his work. But something has shifted in the atmosphere. The other staff members exchange glances, whispering among themselves. How does the janitor know about Brugada syndrome? How does he speak with such clinical precision about sodium channel mutations? What they didn't know was that Miguel Rodriguez had once been Dr. Miguel Rodriguez, one of Mexico's most promising cardiologists who had published research on genetic cardiac conditions and saved countless lives before a family crisis forced him to make an impossible choice. And with just his quiet observation and clinical knowledge, he was about to change not only one patient's life, but challenge every assumption his colleagues had made about worth, intelligence, and the invisible barriers that keep brilliant minds in the shadows, because sometimes the most qualified person in the room is the one everyone assumes knows the least. Sometimes expertise wears coveralls instead of scrubs, and speaks with an accent that others mistake for ignorance, rather than the music of a brilliant mind navigating multiple worlds. The patient's monitor continues its urgent beeping, but Miguel has already seen what needs to be seen. The question isn't whether he's right, it's whether anyone will listen long enough to find out. Before we continue with Miguel's incredible story, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to sharing the untold stories of everyday heroes whose brilliance shines despite the barriers they face. If stories like this inspire you to look beyond first impressions and recognize the hidden expertise around us, please hit that subscribe button. It helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages. And I'm genuinely curious, on a scale of 0 to 10, how often do you think we misjudge someone's capabilities based on their job, accent, or appearance? Drop your honest answer in the comments below, because your perspective matters in this conversation. Now let's dive deeper into who Miguel really was and how his journey led him to that pivotal moment in the hospital corridor. Miguel Rodriguez had worked at Princeton Medical Center for 2.5 years, arriving each morning at 5 a.m. sharp, long before the day shift doctors made their rounds. His responsibilities were simple on paper: maintain cleanliness in the cardiac wing, restock medical supplies, ensure the rooms were spotless for patients and their families. The prestigious medical center prided itself on its world-class facilities, its cutting-edge research, and its reputation for attracting the brightest minds in medicine. The doctors and nurses moved past Miguel as if he were part of the furniture. Necessary but invisible, functional but forgettable. His thick Mexican accent, his quiet demeanor, and his janitor's uniform created a barrier that seemed insurmountable. They saw the surface: an immigrant worker, probably uneducated, certainly not someone whose opinion mattered in their world of life and death decisions. But Miguel watched. He always watched. During his shifts, he absorbed everything: the hurried conversations between residents, the complex discussions about patient care, the frustration in voices when diagnoses proved elusive. His ears, trained through years of medical practice, caught nuances that others missed. He noticed patterns in symptoms, recognized the subtle signs that often preceded medical crises. On that particular Tuesday morning in March, Miguel heard something that made his entire body tense with recognition. "We've been going in circles with this case for 3 hours," Dr. Patterson said to her colleague, her voice strained with exhaustion. 28-year-old male, Hispanic, came in with chest pain and dizziness. His troponin levels are elevated, suggesting heart damage, but the EKG isn't showing a typical heart attack pattern. It's bizarre, almost like the electrical system in his heart is misfiring, but not in any way I've seen before. Miguel moved closer to the nurse's station, methodically, wiping down the counter while his trained mind processed every detail. Those words weren't foreign to him. They were the language he'd spoken fluently for over a decade. Dr. Williams joined the conversation, shaking his head. "The family is getting anxious, and honestly, I don't blame them. We've run every standard. Cardiac test. Maybe we should consider transferring him to a specialist center." Without thinking, Miguel found himself speaking. "The EKG pattern," he said quietly, "in the right precordial leads. Is it showing a COVID-ST elevation? Sometimes this pattern appears only intermittently." The conversation stopped abruptly. Both doctors turned to stare at him, their expressions a mixture of surprise and barely concealed annoyance. "I'm sorry, what?" Dr. Patterson said, her tone sharp with authority. Miguel felt his cheeks warm, but he pressed on. "Brugada syndrome. It can present exactly as you describe. The genetic mutation affects the sodium channels, creating an electrical disturbance that can be life-threatening if not properly managed." Dr. Williams let out a short laugh, the kind that cuts through dignity like a blade. "I think there might." "Be some confusion here," he said with a patronizing smile. "Perhaps you should focus on keeping our floors clean and let us handle the medical mysteries." The dismissal stung, but it wasn't the first time Miguel had experienced this treatment. What hurt most wasn't the condescension. It was watching a patient potentially suffer because pride prevented others from listening. Miguel walked away from the nurse's station, but this time something was different. That wasn't just embarrassment burning in his chest. That was a fire that had been dormant for too long, finally beginning to rekindle. For 2.5 years, he'd accepted his place in this hierarchy. He'd convinced himself that his current role was temporary, that supporting his family was worth any sacrifice of professional identity. But this moment felt different. This wasn't about his ego or his past achievements. This was about a patient who might die because medical knowledge was being ignored based on who was delivering it. As he pushed his cart down the hallway, Miguel's mind wandered to the leather journal hidden in his small apartment, its pages filled with medical research he'd conducted, case studies he'd documented, and the advanced cardiology techniques he'd mastered during his residency at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. In his homeland, colleagues had called him El Corazón, not just because he specialized in hearts, but because he seemed to understand the emotional core of medicine in ways that textbooks couldn't teach. His diagnostic instincts were legendary among his peers, his bedside manner praised by countless families, his research on genetic cardiac conditions published in international medical journals. But here in Princeton, he was just Miguel the janitor, whose heavily accented English was dismissed before the medical accuracy of his words could be evaluated. That evening, as Miguel returned to his modest apartment, he made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't let another patient suffer in silence while his expertise went unrecognized. If they wouldn't listen to Miguel the janitor, perhaps it was time to show them who Dr. Miguel Rodriguez really was. The next morning arrived with an unusual tension in the cardiac wing. Miguel noticed it immediately. The cluster of doctors around the nurse's station, their voices more animated than usual, their body language speaking of urgency and concern. Dr. Patterson's voice carried across the hallway, tinged with frustration and something approaching desperation. "The patient from yesterday is deteriorating. His cardiac rhythms are becoming increasingly unstable, and we still don't have a definitive diagnosis. The family is demanding answers we don't have." Miguel slowed his cleaning routine, positioning himself within earshot while maintaining the appearance of focused work. His trained instincts were already analyzing the situation, medical protocols flooding back with crystal clarity. "We've consulted with cardiology specialists from 3 different hospitals," Dr. Williams added, running his hands through his hair. "They're all suggesting different approaches, but none of them have seen the exact EKG pattern we're dealing with. The patient's brother is asking if we should transfer him to Mount Sinai or Johns Hopkins." The mention of the patient's family sent a jolt through Miguel's consciousness. Another family watching helplessly as their loved one faced an uncertain medical fate. A scenario he knew intimately from both professional and personal experience. Without allowing himself time to reconsider, Miguel approached the group of medical professionals. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his voice remained steady and respectful. "Dr. Patterson," he said, his accent more pronounced under stress, but his medical terminology precise. "Yesterday you mentioned the EKG shows atypical ST elevations in the right precordial leads. If you perform a sodium channel blocker test, perhaps with flecainide or agmaline, it could unmask the characteristic Brugada pattern that might be concealed at baseline." Dead silence fell over the group. 6 pairs of eyes turned to focus on him, with expressions ranging from shock to indignation. Dr. Martinez, the senior attending who had just joined the discussion, stepped forward with barely contained irritation. "This is highly inappropriate," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet corridor. "Medical staff discussions are not open forums for maintenance personnel to offer unsolicited medical advice." Miguel felt the familiar sting of professional dismissal, but this time something deeper was at stake. "The patient's life might depend on accurate diagnosis," he replied, maintaining eye contact despite the hostile atmosphere. "In my experience, Brugada syndrome type 1 can present exactly as you've described, and early identification is crucial for preventing sudden cardiac death." "Your experience?" Dr. Williams scoffed, his tone dripping with condescension. "What exactly would a janitor know about sudden cardiac death or genetic arrhythmia syndromes? Do you realize how ridiculous this sounds?" The laughter that followed was soft but cruel, rippling through the small group of medical professionals. Miguel noticed how some of the nurses looked uncomfortable, their expressions suggesting they recognized the unfairness of the situation even if they wouldn't speak against their superiors. "Perhaps," Dr. Patterson said with forced patience, "you could return to your cleaning duties. We have a patient to save, and frankly, we need fewer distractions right now." Miguel nodded politely, but as he turned to walk away, he couldn't resist. One final comment. The sodium channel blocker test takes approximately 10 minutes to perform. If the patient does have Brugada syndrome, delaying proper treatment could result in ventricular fibrillation and cardiac arrest, especially in a hospital setting where stress levels are elevated. This time, the silence carried a different quality. Dr. Martinez's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with something approaching curiosity. The specific medical knowledge Miguel had just demonstrated wasn't something typically known outside of specialized cardiology training. "How do you know about flecainide testing protocols?" she asked, her voice losing some of its dismissive edge. Miguel met her gaze directly. "Because Brugada syndrome has a higher prevalence in certain genetic populations, particularly those with Southeast Asian and Latin American ancestry. The diagnostic techniques I mentioned are standard protocols in many international medical centers that serve diverse populations." Dr. Williams shook his head in disbelief. "This is absurd. Even if you've read some medical articles online, that doesn't qualify you to participate in patient care decisions." But Dr. Martinez held up a hand, her expression thoughtful. "The patient is Hispanic, and his family history indicates possible genetic predispositions. The symptoms and EKG findings do align with what you're describing." The tension in the hallway was palpable. Miguel could see the internal conflict playing out across the doctors' faces, professional pride warring with the possibility that crucial information was being ignored because of its source. "I'll return to my work," Miguel said quietly, his dignity intact despite the humiliating encounter. "But if the patient's condition continues to deteriorate, the diagnostic test I mentioned could provide answers within minutes rather than hours." As he walked away, Miguel heard Dr. Martinez's voice behind him, speaking in low tones to her colleagues. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone suggested serious consideration rather than dismissal. That afternoon, as Miguel cleaned the cardiac intensive care unit, he overheard fragments of conversation that made his pulse quicken. Words like sodium channel blocker, flecainide test, and Brugada pattern drifted from the patient rooms. They were considering his suggestion. For the first time in 2.5 years, Miguel felt something he'd almost forgotten: the electric thrill of medical diagnosis, the satisfaction of connecting complex symptoms with life-saving treatment protocols. But he also felt something else: the weight of professional invisibility. and the growing determination to prove that expertise doesn't always wear the uniform that others expect. In his modest one-bedroom apartment that evening, Miguel sat at his small kitchen table with a worn leather journal spread before him. The cover was embossed with his full name, Dr. Miguel Antonio Rodriguez, M.D., Cardiologia. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, patient case studies, research notes, and detailed observations about genetic cardiac conditions that had fascinated him throughout his medical career. On the first page, a faded photograph showed a younger Miguel in surgical scrubs, standing proudly next to Dr. Elena Vasquez, the renowned cardiologist who had mentored him through his residency at Mexico City's premier teaching hospital. Below the photo, an inscription read, "Para mi estudiante más brillante, que siempre recuerde que la medicina no es solo ciencia, sino también compasión." Back then, this was his language, his world, his identity. Miguel had been considered one of Mexico's rising stars in interventional cardiology, specializing in genetic arrhythmia disorders that disproportionately affected Latin American populations. His diagnostic accuracy was legendary. Colleagues would seek his opinion on the most challenging cases, and his bedside manner had earned him the nickname El Doctor del Corazón from grateful families. The pages documented cases remarkably, similar to what he'd witnessed at Princeton. Young Hispanic males presenting with Brugada syndrome, families confused by symptoms that seemed to appear and disappear mysteriously, EKG patterns that challenged conventional diagnostic approaches. His research had been published in the International Journal of Cardiology, focusing specifically on genetic variations that made traditional diagnostic criteria insufficient for diverse populations. Miguel turned to a section marked Casos Complejos and found the case that had haunted him for years. Eduardo Martinez, age 26, construction worker, had arrived at Hospital General with chest pain and dizziness that other doctors had initially dismissed as anxiety. Miguel's insistence on genetic testing had revealed Brugada syndrome type 1, a condition that could have killed Eduardo during any moment of physical exertion. The last entry in the journal was dated 3 years ago, just before everything changed. That Tuesday in April had started like any other day in the cardiac catheterization lab. Miguel was preparing for a complex procedure when his phone rang. His sister Carmen, her voice breaking with panic. "Miguel, you need to come home immediately. Mama collapsed at work. They think it's a stroke." His mother, Rosa Rodriguez, had been the foundation of their family since his father's death 12 years earlier. She had worked 3 jobs to put Miguel through medical school, sacrificing her own health and dreams so her son could become the doctor she'd always believed he could be. The irony was devastating. He had dedicated his life to healing hearts, but couldn't fix his mother's brain. The stroke had been massive, leaving Rosa partially paralyzed and requiring constant care. Carmen, a single mother with 2 young children, couldn't manage alone. The medical bills were crushing, even with Miguel's salary, and the specialized therapy Rosa needed wasn't covered by Mexico's public health system. Miguel faced an impossible choice: continue his rising medical career while his mother suffered, or sacrifice everything to ensure she received proper care. The decision, when it came, felt both inevitable and heartbreaking. Miguel sold his medical practice, liquidated his research equipment, and used every peso to move his family to the United States, where Rosa could access better rehabilitation services. His Mexican medical license meant nothing in America. Years of additional training, examinations, and certification would be required before he could practice again. But Rosa needed care immediately, and Miguel needed income immediately. The custodial job at Princeton Medical Center was supposed to be temporary, just until he could navigate the complex process of medical license transfer and certification. 3 years later, Rosa's condition had stabilized, but the bureaucratic maze of international medical credential recognition seemed endless. Meanwhile, Miguel watched his professional identity slowly erode, his clinical skills growing rusty from disuse, his confidence shaken by constant dismissal from colleagues who saw only his accent and his uniform. The last time he had touched this journal, he'd been Dr. Rodriguez, respected cardiologist and published researcher. He never imagined that the next time he opened it, he would be Miguel the janitor, whose medical expertise was treated as an amusing curiosity rather than life-saving knowledge. But this time, Miguel didn't cry as he read through his old cases. Instead, he turned to a fresh page and began writing. Patient presentation. Hispanic male, age 28, chest pain and dizziness. Elevated troponin. Atypical EKG pattern. Suspected diagnosis. Brugada syndrome type 1. Recommended diagnostic protocol. Sodium channel blocker test with flecainide. Prognosis with early intervention. Excellent. Prognosis without proper diagnosis. Potentially fatal. At the bottom of the page, he wrote, "Sometimes the most important medical consultation comes from the most unexpected source. Tomorrow, I stop being invisible." Miguel closed the journal and looked at his reflection in the darkened window. For 3 years, he had been Dr. Rodriguez trapped in Miguel's body. But perhaps it was time to show Princeton Medical Center that excellence doesn't disappear just because it wears different clothes. There it is, he whispered to himself, touching the journal's cover. It was always there. The medical center was still cloaked in pre-dawn darkness when Miguel stepped through the employee entrance at 4:30 a.m. Instead of his usual cleaning supplies, he carried his leather journal and a manila folder containing documents he had kept, hidden for 3 years. The hallways echoed with his footsteps as he moved with purpose toward the cardiac wing. He entered the break room through his maintenance key access, knowing it would be empty for another hour before the day shift arrived. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the coffee machine and the distant beeping of patient monitors. Miguel had never used this space for anything other than restocking supplies, but today felt different. No hesitation. Miguel opened his journal to the research section and spread his documentation across the break room table. Using his personal laptop, something his colleagues had never seen him use, he accessed the Princeton Medical Center's internal system with his employee credentials. His fingers moved with the precision of someone who had navigated complex medical databases for years. The patient's file appeared on his screen. David Morales, 28, admitted with chest pain, dizziness, and atypical cardiac symptoms. Miguel's trained eye immediately recognized the EKG patterns he had suspected. Subtle but diagnostic indicators that had been overlooked because they didn't fit standard textbook presentations. Working quickly, Miguel prepared a comprehensive diagnostic report. He documented the specific genetic factors that made Brugada syndrome more prevalent in Hispanic populations, included references to his published research on the condition, and outlined a detailed treatment protocol that could save David's life. Most importantly, he provided the medical credentials and evidence that would prove his expertise was far from coincidental. When he finished, Miguel looked at the completed report. 15 pages of detailed medical analysis that would have impressed any cardiologist in the world. There was nothing left to question about his qualifications or his diagnostic accuracy. Quietly, he left copies of the report in Dr. Martinez's mailbox, Dr. Patterson's office, and with the charge nurse's overnight documentation. Then he returned to his custodial duties, pushing his cart through the familiar hallways as if nothing had changed. The discovery happened exactly as Miguel had anticipated. At 7:15 a.m., Dr. Martinez arrived to find the detailed medical report waiting on her desk. Her voice echoed down the hallway as she called to her colleagues. "Patterson! Williams! You need to see this immediately," she shouted, her tone filled with amazement and confusion. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered around the nurses' station. Miguel continued his cleaning routine nearby, close enough to hear every word of their discussion, but maintaining his carefully constructed invisibility. "This diagnostic analysis is extraordinary," Dr. Patterson whispered, her voice filled with professional awe. "The level of detail about Brugada syndrome variants, the genetic research citations, the specific treatment protocols, this could save our patient's life." Dr. Williams examined the report with growing bewilderment. "But who wrote this? The medical knowledge here is PhD-level cardiology research. Look at these references. Half of them are from international journals I've never even heard of." Dr. Martinez had pulled up Miguel's published research on her computer, her eyes widening as she read. "The lead author on this genetic cardiology study is Dr. Miguel Antonio Rodriguez. This work was published in some of the most prestigious cardiac journals in the world." "Rodriguez?" Dr. Patterson looked confused. "The only Rodriguez we have in this department is—" Her voice trailed off as understanding began to dawn. The same Rodriguez who had tried to tell them about Brugada syndrome, who had mentioned sodium channel blockers and flecainide testing, who had demonstrated knowledge that should have been impossible for a janitor to possess. Dr. Martinez picked up the phone and called security. "I need you to pull the employment records for Miguel Rodriguez in custodial services. I need to know everything about his background. Education, previous employment, medical credentials. Yes, the janitor. And I need it now." Soon, the truth began to emerge. Security pulled Miguel's immigration and employment records, revealing fragments of a story that none of them had bothered to learn. Previous employment: cardiologist, Hospital General de Mexico. Education: Doctor en Medicina, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. Professional specialization: genetic cardiac, arrhythmia disorders. The social media buzz started within hours. Someone had shared the story of the janitor, who turned out to be a brilliant cardiologist, and the Princeton Medical Center's Twitter account was flooded with comments about hidden expertise and the importance of recognizing talent regardless of its packaging. "This could be the medical story of the year," one tweet read. "Brilliant Mexican cardiologist saves American patient while working as hospital janitor. How many other medical professionals are we overlooking?" The story spread rapidly through medical social networks, with doctors from around the world sharing similar experiences of international colleagues whose expertise had been dismissed or ignored because of language barriers, immigration status, or career circumstances beyond their control. By noon, local news stations were requesting interviews, and the hospital's administration was scrambling to understand how they had employed a world-class cardiologist as custodial staff for nearly 3 years without recognizing his qualifications. Miguel continued his work shift as usual, but he noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms, but not with the indifference he was accustomed to. Instead, there was something new in people's eyes: curiosity, respect, and perhaps a touch of embarrassment about previous assumptions. They pulled Miguel's complete employment file, and there she was, the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 years. Miguel Antonio Rodriguez, M.D., the documents clearly stated, followed by an impressive list of credentials that none of them had bothered to investigate. "That's the janitor," whispered Dr. Williams, his voice barely audible as the reality of their oversight became impossible to ignore. The conference room felt smaller than usual when Miguel was asked to join the hospital's senior medical staff later that afternoon. He sat across from Doctors Martinez, Patterson, and Williams, with the chief of cardiology, Dr. Rebecca Hayes, presiding over what felt more like a medical tribunal than a staff meeting. His leather journal rested on the polished table between them, now serving as evidence rather than a hidden relic of his past. "You want to know who I am," Miguel said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of this moment. "So, I'll tell you." Dr. Hayes leaned forward, her expression a mixture of professional curiosity and administrative concern. "Dr. Rodriguez, we need to understand how one of Mexico's leading cardiologists ended up working in our custodial department. More importantly, we need to understand how we failed to recognize your qualifications." Miguel opened his journal to the photograph of himself with Dr. Elena Vasquez, his beloved mentor. 15 years ago, I graduated summa cum laude from Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. I completed my residency in interventional cardiology under Dr. Vasquez, who taught me that medicine is not just about diagnosing diseases, but about seeing the whole person, their family, their fears, their hopes. He turned the pages slowly, showing research documentation, patient case studies, and published papers that demonstrated a level of medical expertise that surpassed many of the doctors in the room. I specialized in genetic cardiac arrhythmias because I noticed that traditional diagnostic criteria often failed patients from Latin American populations. My research identified specific genetic variants that cause Brugada syndrome to present differently in Hispanic patients, exactly what you encountered with David Morales. Dr. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Your diagnostic accuracy with David's case was remarkable. The sodium channel blocker test confirmed Brugada syndrome type 1, and the treatment protocol you outlined likely saved his life. But why didn't you tell us about your background? Miguel's expression grew more serious, and for the first time, emotion crept into his voice. Because 3 years ago, my mother suffered a massive stroke. Rosa Rodriguez, the woman who cleaned office buildings for 12 years to pay for my medical education, needed specialized care that wasn't available in Mexico. I had a choice: continue my career while she suffered, or sacrifice everything to ensure she could receive proper treatment. The silence in the room was profound. These doctors, who dealt with life and death decisions daily, suddenly understood the impossible choice that had brought Miguel to their hospital. I sold my medical practice, liquidated my research equipment, and spent my life savings to bring my family to the United States. My Mexican medical license meant nothing here. The certification process would take years, and Mama needed help immediately. The custodial position was supposed to be temporary. Dr. Williams, who had been the most dismissive of Miguel's knowledge, now looked visibly uncomfortable. But surely you knew that your medical expertise was being wasted. Why didn't you apply for positions that matched your qualifications? Miguel's laugh was gentle, but tinged with sadness. Dr. Williams, for 3 years I have listened to medical discussions in these hallways. I have tried to contribute when patients' lives were at stake. Every time, I was dismissed not because my medical knowledge was incorrect, but because you couldn't see past my accent, my uniform, and your assumptions about who deserves to be heard in medical settings. Dr. Martinez nodded slowly, recognition dawning in her eyes. The Hendricks case last year, you tried to suggest a diagnosis for the patient with the unusual chest pain symptoms. Cardiac tamponade secondary to pericarditis, Miguel confirmed. The patient was experiencing Beck's triad: elevated venous pressure, muffled heart sounds, and decreased arterial pressure. Classic presentation, but easily missed if you're not looking for the complete syndrome. You were right then, too, Dr. Hayes admitted. "We figured it out eventually, but your early recognition could have prevented the patient's deterioration." Miguel closed his journal and looked directly at each doctor in the room. "I didn't leave medicine. Medicine never left me. I just had to walk away for love. Every day, I watched patients suffer, while my knowledge went ignored. Not because I wasn't qualified, but because I didn't fit your image of what medical expertise looks like." The weight of their collective oversight hung heavy in the air. These were brilliant doctors who had dedicated their lives to healing. But they had allowed prejudice and assumption to blind them to the extraordinary expertise of someone they saw every day. In that quiet office, they finally saw Miguel, Dr. Hayes said softly. Not as the janitor with the heavy accent, but as Dr. Rodriguez, a world-class cardiologist whose compassion had driven him to sacrifice his career for family, and whose expertise had never wavered despite being invisible to those who should have recognized it immediately. The next morning, Miguel stepped into Princeton Medical Center like always. But something was fundamentally different. Instead of the usual hurried indifference, the cardiac wing had fallen into an unusual quiet as he approached. Then, like a wave-building momentum, applause began to ripple through the hallway. The room was silent for just a moment, then erupted in sustained clapping. Nurses who had walked past him for 3 years now stood respectfully, their faces showing genuine admiration. Dr. Patterson approached him first, her expression humble and grateful. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, emphasizing his proper title, "I want to personally thank you for saving David Morales' life. Your diagnostic expertise and persistence, despite our failure to listen, prevented what could have been a fatal cardiac event." Dr. Martinez joined her, carrying a folder that would change everything. "Miguel, the hospital administration has reviewed your qualifications, and we'd like to offer you a position in our cardiology department. We're also prepared to support you through the medical license transfer process, with full salary and benefits while you complete the certification requirements." But Miguel, ever the thoughtful physician, had conditions that surprised them. "I'm grateful for this opportunity," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had always been there, now finally recognized. "But I accept under one condition. I want to continue working with the custodial and support staff. They see things that medical professionals often miss, and their observations could save lives if anyone bothered to listen." Later that afternoon, the Princeton Medical Center auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Local news crews had set up cameras, medical students filled every available seat, and doctors from neighboring hospitals had come to hear the story that was already spreading through medical communities nationwide. Miguel stepped up to the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some guilty, many inspired by a story that challenged every assumption about expertise and worth. "3 years ago, I began working in your hallways," he began, his accent no longer a barrier, but a beautiful reminder of his journey. "Every day, I watched brilliant medical professionals save lives, solve complex diagnoses, and provide compassionate care to families in crisis. I was honored to be part of that environment, even in the smallest way." He paused, his eyes scanning the audience that now hung on every word. "But I also watched as valuable insights were dismissed because they came from unexpected sources. I saw cleaning staff notice patient behavioral changes that could indicate medication reactions. I observed dietary workers recognize cultural food preferences that could improve patient compliance. I witnessed security guards identify family stress patterns that could impact recovery outcomes." The auditorium was completely silent, absorbing the profound implications of his words. "Medicine is not just about the degrees on our walls, or the titles on our lab coats. It's about recognizing that healing happens through the collective wisdom of everyone who cares for patients. The person emptying trash might notice things the attending physician misses. The person serving meals might understand cultural factors that impact recovery. Dr. Hayes had joined him on stage, carrying an official document that represented institutional change. Today, Princeton Medical Center is creating the Rodriguez Fellows Program, she announced, designed to identify and support medical professionals whose credentials may not be recognized in the United States, but whose expertise could save lives. We're also implementing mandatory training for all staff on unconscious bias and the importance of listening to insights regardless of their source. The applause was thunderous, but Miguel raised his hand for silence. He had one more point to make. To the young medical students in this audience, I want you to remember this. Excellence doesn't always wear the uniform you expect. Brilliance speaks many languages, with many accents, from many different backgrounds. Your future patients will be served best when you learn to recognize wisdom wherever it appears. He looked directly at the cameras, knowing his message would reach far beyond this auditorium. And to the healthcare professionals watching, I challenge you to look around your own institutions. Who are you not seeing? Whose voices are you not hearing? How much expertise is going unrecognized because it doesn't match your expectations? The entire room stood in unison, the applause lasting several minutes. But for Miguel, the most meaningful moment came when he saw David Morales and his family in the front row. The young man whose life had been saved by medical knowledge that almost went unheard. After the presentation, as Miguel walked through the same hallways where he had been, invisible for 3 years, everything had changed. Nurses greeted him as Dr. Rodriguez. Other support staff smiled with new recognition of their own value. Medical students sought his advice on patient cases, but perhaps most importantly, he noticed doctors stopping to listen when custodial staff made observations about patients. The culture was shifting, one conversation at a time. That evening, as Miguel returned to his apartment, he found his mother Rosa waiting in her wheelchair, her eyes bright with pride despite the limitations her stroke had imposed. "Mijo," she said in Spanish, her speech still slightly slurred but her love crystal clear. "Today, I watched the news. I saw my son, the doctor I always knew you were, teaching the world that greatness comes in many forms." Miguel knelt beside her wheelchair and took her weathered hands in his. "Mama, everything I did was for you. But today I learned it was also for everyone who has ever been underestimated because of how they look, how they speak, or what job they do." 6 months later, Dr. Miguel Rodriguez splits his time between the cardiac catheterization lab and the Rodriguez Fellows Program, which has already identified 12 internationally trained medical professionals working in non-medical roles throughout the Princeton Medical Center system. The program has become a model for hospitals nationwide, demonstrating that institutional change is possible when organizations commit to recognizing talent wherever it exists. Miguel still arrives at 5 a.m. each morning, but now he uses that quiet time to review patient cases and prepare for complex cardiac procedures. His diagnostic accuracy has become legendary among the medical staff, but more importantly, his story has fundamentally changed how the entire hospital approaches expertise and respect. The custodial staff now participate in weekly rounds where their patient observations are formally incorporated into care plans. 3 lives have been saved in the past 6 months because cleaning personnel noticed subtle changes in patient behavior that indicated medical complications. David Morales, the patient whose Brugada syndrome diagnosis started this transformation, has become a powerful advocate for medical diversity and cultural competency. His family established a scholarship fund for Hispanic medical students, ensuring that future generations of doctors will reflect the communities they serve. Dr. Rodriguez's research on genetic cardiac conditions in diverse populations has resumed with full institutional support. His work is already being cited by cardiologists worldwide, and his methods for culturally competent cardiac care are being adopted by medical schools across the country. But perhaps the most profound change is in the small daily interactions. Throughout Princeton Medical Center, doctors now introduce themselves to support staff, learning names and backgrounds they had ignored for years. Medical students are required to spend time with custodial, dietary, and maintenance workers, understanding that patient care is truly a team effort. The moral of Miguel's story resonates far beyond the medical field. Expertise doesn't diminish. Because it speaks with an accent, brilliance doesn't disappear because it wears work clothes, and the most qualified person in the room might be the one everyone assumes knows the least. Sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come not from discovering something new, but from finally recognizing what was always there. Sometimes change begins when we stop seeing job titles and start seeing human potential. And sometimes the most important lesson is the simplest one. Everyone deserves to be heard, because you never know whose voice might save a life. In a world quick to judge based on appearance, accent, or occupation, Miguel Rodriguez's story reminds us that greatness often hides in plain sight, waiting patiently for someone wise enough to listen.